Welcome to LinkedIn Live with personal brand authority, Lida Citroėn. Lida is an award-winning executive coach, speaker, and author working with clients in over 30 countries. She helps professionals, entrepreneurs, and business leaders manage the way they're perceived by the people who matter most. From leadership development, executive presence, to strategic communications and social media positioning, Lida's work is thoughtful, motivating, and practical. Get ready for a great program. Here's Lida.
Well, hello. Welcome to another LinkedIn Live, where we're going to be bringing you tons of really practical and inspiring content focused today around the concept of mastering effective communication. If you've been part of my programs before, you know one of my favorite things to ask at the beginning is, let us know where you're calling in from. What part of the world, what part of the states are you in? I see some of you already were starting to populate that before we even went live. So appreciate you doing that. And as I sort of tee up today's conversation, keep those comments coming in. We love to see your comments. There you go. Everybody's doing that. That's fabulous. We have such an incredible conversation. But I want to start off and tell you a story. I remember a few years ago, more than a few years ago, I was in between jobs, let's say, and I'd been in the job search. I had all these resumes out. I'd interviewed for a couple positions. I was really hoping for one. And it was a Tuesday. I was sitting by the phone and I thought, I'm just going to grab the kids and go to Costco. And I went to Costco to keep my mind occupied, and I got the phone call. They offered me the position. The terms were exactly what I wanted, and I was so excited. I think I was even in the cereal aisle. I remember it so clearly. And as soon as I hung up with my now new employer, I immediately phoned my husband and I told him the good news. I said, I just got a job offer and I'm going to accept. And he said, well, where are you? I said, I'm at Costco. And there was silence. And I thought that was odd. And then he said, I didn't know you wanted to work at Costco. He didn't have context for what I was talking about. I hadn't framed up the conversation to let him know that no, I was not in fact being hired to work at Costco. I had received the call while there. Context matters with communication. Effective communication is not just about being an extrovert. It's not just about being loud and proud or large and in charge, being the biggest voice in the room. Effective communication is knowing how to craft a message, deliver it with confidence, and make sure that the recipient of that message receives it in the way you intend. So if you're asking your boss for a promotion or a raise or some additional resources, it's really important as you frame up effective communication that you have the context your boss needs to receive that in. You have to think about timing. You have to think about the important factors that go into that decision. If you're trying to convince a client to buy more from you or increase their relationship with your company, you have to know what the client cares about in order to frame up and package that request. If you're trying to convince your spouse that a weekend away with your friends would be really good for your mental health, you similarly have to remember their perspective, understand the context, understand the timing, and present your message in a way that makes the most sense so it lands the right way and you get the best outcome. Effective communication in all aspects of our life is as much science as it is art. There's nuance to it. It is about things like eloquence and empathy and gravitas and body language and how we communicate wholeheartedly, not just the words, because the words can be wrong, the context can be missed, and the opportunity can be lost. So if these are things that you're wrestling with and you're trying to figure out how do you best communicate, you're in a great place for today, because that's exactly what we're going to talk about. I will give a side note that if you're struggling with how to talk to your boss at work, I'm going to give a plug for my LinkedIn Learning course, How to Have an Honest Career Conversation with Your Boss. It is a fabulous course. We did it on LinkedIn Learning. It got lots of reviews. It still does. I know Sabrina is going to put a link, she just did, in the chat to the course. Check it out. We've got different scenarios we run through in that program. But today we are joined by someone I know very, very well, and I am really excited to introduce him to all of you. Charles Good is the president of the Institute for Management Studies. For more than a decade, he has helped leaders at all levels lead and communicate more effectively. IMS's mission is to leverage the power of thought leadership to improve the practice of management. During their 50-year history, they've educated more than 250,000 leaders and played a role in the transformation of thousands of large companies, many of which are in the Fortune 1000. Their passion isn't just teaching the information, but it's getting application, skill building, because it's not what people know that makes a difference, it's what they do. And I'm proud to say I am an educator and instructor with IMS and have been working with Charles and his team for years now. And the quality of the programs is absolutely amazing. So welcome to the conversation, Charles.
Thank you for that nice introduction, Lida. Enjoy being here and looking forward to our discussion around effective communication.
Fabulous. Well, today we're talking about, obviously, how do you master effective communication? We know how to speak, we know how to talk, but what is the one thing, in your opinion, that we should all be thinking about when we think about mastering how we communicate?
Well, I'll start with something that I think a lot of people don't realize, right? And it's because 60% of our errors in the workplace can be traced back to communication failure. And half of your communication, and I'm not sure if anyone can guess this, but is listening, not actually speaking. So I think when we look at communication, we're really focused on how can we say it more articulate? How can we be more persuasive, more influential? But a lot of communication issues would be resolved if we just were a better listener and practice some active listening skills, which a lot of people have struggled with, or it's declined in years, right? Because we're in a distraction-filled society. So much technology is out there. We're doing so many things in the background that it's really difficult for us to really pay attention to what someone else is saying.
Do you have any tips for how we could get better at active listening?
Yeah, so even if you're listening to someone, and you might listen to someone, and this probably has played out many times for you, where you've listened to someone and you can say, okay, they don't feel like you're listening to them, but you can repeat back what they said, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, so even though you're repeating back and you're listening, you're not getting credit for listening to them. So obviously, you want to get credit for that. You want to make sure that people acknowledge that, yes, I'm listening to you, and it's something that I'm valuing. So there's a couple things that we really recommend for active listening. It's really focusing on the person, right? So it starts with eye contact. It starts with being engaged, having your attention on them. And then it's verbally and non-verbally acknowledging. So when you were talking, I was nodding, or I was just saying, uh-huh, great, yes, I agree. That tells them you're listening as well. But it's more than that. That's just really the first step, because there's really two parts to understanding, right? First, you're understanding their words, you're remembering what they're saying and engage with that. The second level of understanding really involves their emotions, their nonverbal language. What are they really meaning? So in that case, you want to also blend with them. So if you're kind of moving in, blending is anything you're doing that's mirroring the other person. We'll get more into that in the body language part, but just saying, if they're moving in, you're moving in as well. If they're talking fast, you pick up the speed of your speech. If it's a high tone, you're talking a little bit higher, right? So that blending really connects you with that other person, and it makes them feel that you're hearing what they're saying. And then throughout too, you kind of want to backtrack too, right? So you don't want it to go too long. And if they pause, backtrack, clarify, and summarize some of the things they're saying as well, so that they feel like, wow, you're hearing me.
Well, and one of the techniques that I've used, because I tend to talk to people who talk even faster than I do. And sometimes, I can feel my adrenaline going because we've just covered an hour's worth of content in 10 minutes, is to what you said, match their pace But then as you've matched it, start to kind of slow it down a little bit, because it can become hyper fast or hyper high pitched, and you can match them, but then start to lower it a little bit. And strategically, that gets them more comfortable, even though they don't even realize what's happening. Have you seen that at work?
You're right. Once you establish that connection, then you can kind of control it a little bit more. So you can get them to slow down, to engage more with you in your preferred style. But always stay curious. Don't be judgmental when you're listening. Don't practice pseudo listening where you're kind of just waiting for them to stop talking so that you can start talking, or you're not even really comprehending, or it's not even connecting what they're saying. Let them empty their bucket, right? And let them feel understood. And then the second part of that is really, you being understood, right? But they need to feel understood first.
Well, and as you were talking, I was thinking about how we do these techniques online, right? Because a lot of us are working in a remote or still hybrid environment. What are some tips for active listening if you're not face to face?
So really, it's important for you to put your video camera on. I mean, in a virtual space, if you can, if you're on a call like this, if you're on Zoom, if you're on Teams, try to get the video on so they can see that you're listening to them, with the eye contact, with the verbals, right? That you can do even without video. But the more you can engage non-verbally and verbally, make them feel understood, and then repeating back what they're saying selectively, right? In their own words, because their words have meaning. So don't try to summarize their words. Just say, here's what I think that you're saying. That really is helpful as well, especially in the virtual environment, because I know with my company, we've done so many of these programs, hundreds of these programs. I try to get people on video right from the start, because I know they're not going to be doing something in the background, and they're going to be more actively engaged and listening to what we're saying.
Well, and a tip I always like to say is look at the camera, right? And it's awkward because your face is down here, and it's more natural for me to look at you here, but this is eye contact. And for most of us, we might have multiple monitors. And I always see people on Zoom calls or Teams meetings, and they're doing this.
Right.
But the camera's picking up their side. So it's those small little things that let the other person know, like you said, that we're present, we're paying attention, and we're dialed in.
And a quick little tip for that, because you're right, so often our camera's not where we're looking, because that's not where the audience is. What I do is a little post-it note with the smiley face, and it just kind of directs my gaze to the camera, right?
Yeah.
So that helps you just to keep that engagement going and looking at the camera, even though you may not be able to look at the attendees at the same time.
Absolutely. And you touched on something that I'd like to unpack a little bit more now, which is body language. We know that when we communicate a message, I guess, unless it's written, that effective communication has a lot to do with the nonverbal part of communication, which is what we see and what we hear, the tonality and volume. Can you talk a little bit about what some of the key body language issues are that we should pay attention to? And then the follow-up to that is, how do we detect people being deceptive?
Sure.
That was a tongue twister.
There you go. Well, right, because a lot of our communication is not verbally, right? I mean, there's different percentages and different formulas that people use, but by far and large, you can pretty much assume that a lot of what I'm communicating is not coming through with the words that I'm saying. It's coming through nonverbals. And nonverbals, really, you need to be the first thing that you need to be is a competent observer of your environment. Make sure that you establish baseline behavior. So if I don't know you, Lida, I'm not going to make any assumptions until we have a conversation, so I can see and try to get you at ease, so that I know how it is when you're comfortable, so that when I see any behaviors that would indicate you're not comfortable, I know what to look for. So be observer of the environment, identify a baseline behavior for that person, get them comfortable, and look for multiple tells. So you're not just looking for one thing, you're looking for multiple things happening together that would indicate something's not right. And you can do this a lot easier with people because you already know their baseline behavior. So you're very good, and many of us are good at, with a spouse, with a family member, to know, okay, they're not comfortable about what they're doing. Or with children, when they're lying, they're not very good liars, right? So you kind of know something's not right here. And a lot of deception detecting is really about stressing, looking for indicators of uncomfortableness or stress. It's not about lying. It's about there's something that's making them uncomfortable, and why. So with body language, I'll cover just two things. It's a huge field to unpack. One, I'll give you some insights on what to do when you're live and in person, another when you're virtual. So first, let's talk about live and in person. Have a question for everyone. What's the most honest part of your body when it comes to nonverbal behaviors? So if you could put it in the chat, maybe Lida can read those off or
So what do you think is the most non-obvious? What was the question? Most
the most honest part of your body
honest part of your body. What do you
for
think?
nonverbal behavior.
Go ahead and put in the chat what you think is the most telling or honest part of your body language. Let's see what our LinkedIn watchers, participants. Oh, Steve says feet. Let's see who else has an idea. Eyes. Okay, we're getting some great comments. Keep them coming. Eyes, eyes. Ooh, lots of eyes. I would say the eyes have it, but
All right. Well,
face. Okay. Hands, feet, eyes. We're staying in that area.
all right, good. Well, the most honest part of your body is the part of the body that's the farthest away from your brain because you have less awareness of what's going on. It's your feet. Many people don't realize that, but the feet are very accurate indicators of what a person is thinking. So someone comes into your office, you're having a conversation with that person. Maybe it's happening for 5 minutes and you glance down at their feet and their feet are pointing toward the door. That's an indicator that they're really not engaged. They want to leave the room versus if they're pointing at you. You look at when people are standing around others and you're trying to identify who's the influencer or the leader in this group. Usually everyone's pointing to the leader with their feet. So the feet are very accurate indicators. It's really hard to identify the feet on Zoom or on a virtual platform. But when you're in the office, especially for interviewing, feet, if you can see their feet, you can see how they're doing, if they feel confident in what they're saying. Happy feet that have like gravity defying behaviors, like they're bouncing up, they have a bounce in their step. That's usually a positive sign. They're confident. They have a positive feeling about what they're saying. So it's, that's a good indicator. If someone's sitting down and their feet are wrapped up underneath them, they're not that confident in what they're saying. There's some distress or discomfort that you might want to unpack either through a question that you ask them or possibly through just noticing it and seeing if there's other tells throughout the conversation and saying, okay, your feet were kind of sprawled out and then they all of a sudden went up behind your chair. Why was that? Was the question was uncomfortable? Were you not confident in what you were saying? Or maybe it was something that you were trying to deceive something or someone on. So look for those gravity-defying behaviors, those positive behaviors with the feet, where the feet are pointing. And then if there's some indicator that it's changed, where they were positive and all of a sudden they became more quiet, the feet, not bouncing, or they were wrapped up underneath your chair. Those are all pretty good indicators of something's going on. You don't know what. You might want to probe with a question or just simply note it for the future.
What about crossing arms? We had several people mention that. And I know when I teach body language, I often unpack that one specifically because a lot of people misinterpret sometimes why somebody might cross their arms. What do you have to say on that one?
So really, it's establishing that baseline behavior, right? Because they could be crossing their arms because it's cold. They're nervous because it's an interview. So in that case, there's really nothing that you can do about it, and it doesn't indicate anything negative. But in other cases, it could indicate they're closed off. They're really not buying to what you're saying. So a couple things that you can do is to try to ask those questions or give them something to hold, right? Say, here, can you hold this? That will get their arms uncrossed. And believe it or not, when that happens, they do become more receptive to what you're saying. Not much, but a little bit, right? You want to have them have that expansive posture. And so use those indicators in the environment. It could be because of the temperature of the room. It could be because they're shut off. Try to give them something to hold. Maybe you have a handout and just hand it to them. On a virtual stage, it's a little bit more difficult, right? To have that. It just means maybe that you're not connecting or they're just not buying what you're saying. So you might want to present it a different way or try a different angle, a different approach.
Well, and to your point, it's paying attention to the context, right? Which we talked about at the beginning. So did the air conditioning just kick on? Did you just ask for a raise and your boss sat back and crossed their arms, right? It's what happened right before the gesture. And some people are pointing out, and I agree, I know, for my father who had a very tunned tummy. This was very comfortable. This was his resting place. And that was just a relaxed, soothing position for him. So we always have to think about the context, right? Talk a little bit more about virtual, because we hinted about that and we talked about looking at the camera. What else can we do to manage and make sure our message is communicated right when we're in a virtual environment?
So you want congruence, Lita, between what you're saying and the nonverbals. And that means you want it to be in alignment. So if I'm saying, Lita, I agree with you completely. This is a phenomenal idea. And you saw what I was doing. I was saying it verbally, but I was shaking my head. I really don't agree. So, and many people don't understand body language well enough, but they still have that feeling like, I don't think he was really buying what I was saying. He said he agreed, but there was something that indicated they can't put their finger on it, right? But there was something that just didn't line up. So you get that feeling that's like, okay, I don't know what it was, but it just wasn't connecting like it should. And with virtual, you can only see from basically the shoulder up. So it's really about the face. The eyes are not always great indicators of honesty, especially as you get to be an adult, because you learn how to control that better. But there's certain things you can still look on for your face. So negative emotions of the face come out with flaring of the nostrils. They really didn't like what you just stated. The jaw muscles tighten, right? The quivering of the mouth, or just lip occlusion, where I just, hide my lips when I'm nervous, when I'm not comfortable with what I'm saying, or when I start licking my lips because saliva is drying up because I'm more nervous. So those would be indicators that it's really hard for people to control these. That's why they're such great, accurate indicators. But it means you got to be paying attention to those, because if you're not paying attention, you're not going to catch it. And you could miss a lot of what they're actually saying.
Well, and I'm keeping an eye on the chat, and there's some conversation around able-bodied and non-able-bodied and how that can affect body language. And absolutely similar to culture, right? Certain cultural norms come into play here. So I think what you and I are talking about is the most baseline of expectations and considering context, right? So if you're speaking to somebody from a culture where eye contact is looked upon differently, you're going to respect the cultural nuances of that. If you've got someone who is not able-bodied, then maybe their feet aren't the most telling part of their body language. So we're giving the big picture here on body language as it relates to effective communication. And I do appreciate some of the things that are coming up in the chat regarding that.
And some of these are universal, regardless of culture. Some of these are culture dependent, especially when it comes to eye gazing, right? I get this question asked a lot. Is that, so where should I gaze my eyes when I'm talking to someone? Because some people feel, and I didn't even know this was an issue, but the more questions I got about it, I'm like, okay, well, here's some indicators. So if you want someone that, make you feel more comfortable, then you should be looking between their eyes and their mouth down a little bit. That makes them feel more comfortable. If you want a more intimidating gaze, then you want to focus between their eyes and the middle part of their forehead, especially if someone's, doesn't want to stop talking, right? And you just want them to stop talking and maybe have your chance to express what you want to say. That would be a good strategy as well. You believe it or not, those are effective strategies that just kind of subtly hint at, okay, here's how the conversation's going. Here's, I'm more intimidating, or I'm more comfortable with you. Obviously, a downward gaze doesn't mean people aren't engaged. They're processing a lot when they're looking down. So just keep that in mind with eye gazing. Also, the other thing that I'll say about the eyes is that there's a thing called eye blocking. So when they really don't like what they're hearing, or they're seeing rather, if they don't like what they're seeing, maybe it's just off-putting, maybe it's offensive to them, maybe they just don't care for it, they will find a way to block their eyes. So maybe it's taking off their glasses and just rubbing their eyes. Maybe it's just closing their eyes. Whatever that is, that's an indicator that something that really caused them to see something they really didn't care for. And it's a subtle hint, but it's something you might want to probe, right? And once again, look for context.
Absolutely. So you hinted at this with the example of someone who doesn't stop talking, but I think we've all worked with people and for people and who are difficult to communicate with, right? Difficult conversation, difficult personalities, whether it's for us or they're just in general difficult. What are some ways, if let's say it's your boss or senior management or a customer, client, what are some ways that we can navigate effectively challenging conversations?
So challenging conversations are always difficult. Everyone has issues with them. I haven't met too many people that enjoy them. And a lot of people, the default way that they deal with them is just putting them off, ignoring the situation, which never results in a good resolution on a personal level or on a more professional level. So really, you want to make sure that you handle it in a timely manner, monitor your tone of voice, state your positive intent, right? Assume coming into it that it's positive, that they're not coming in just to do something mean or negative, that they really have a positive intent, and it may be disguised as a difficult behavior. So as you're telling your truth of the situation, a couple things to note. One, use I language from my point of view, the way I see it, so that they don't take offense with that. That's just coming from your point of view, your perspective. They could disagree with it, but it doesn't set up that argument, that contradiction. Be specific about the problem behavior, show them how the behavior may be self-defeating, and then reinforce behavior change as a result.
Well, and I think a little bit of empathy also comes into play
Of
here,
course.
because sometimes people are difficult because of stressors that they have. And not that we have to change who we are. We should never change who we are for someone else, but we can modify our behavior. So one example I sometimes bring up is, if you've got to ask your boss for additional resources or funding, or you want to raise, and that person is typically someone a little bit hard to deal with, make sure your timing is right. Make sure they have all the information ahead of time. Make sure that they're the right person to make that decision, because you can constantly set them up to become more unhappy if your requests or the context or the timing is off. And we also don't want to be that person who's difficult to deal with. So what if as we're talking, Charles, someone listening says, wow, maybe I am the person that's hard to communicate with? What can we do if that's us?
Well, having that awareness is great. And just remember, you're probably your difficult person's difficult person, right? So keep that in mind as well. Having more awareness, getting that feedback, whether it's 360s at work or just asking your spouse, or a partner. The majority of them are more than happy to tell you probably all the things that you could improve upon. And it's getting that feedback and receiving it, because a lot of people, it's tough to get that feedback and it's tough to change. But it's critical for your development, not only at a professional level, but also improving relationships outside of the workplace.
Well, and Susie's asking a great question, which I think it makes sense to interject here. And that is, you mentioned earlier the person who does all the talking, right? I know as an extrovert, I think my voice sounds best to me, right? So I'm always doing the talking. But what about if you've got someone who is constantly the one sharing and talking? And how do you get in there? How do you compete? How do you stop that momentum so that other people can have a chance to participate?
Well, it's really, it depends on your role within that group, right? If you're the leader, you have a little bit more control. If not, you have to really do it more tactfully. And with that kind of individual that likes the limelight, that likes to get in there and tell everything about themselves, then it's really difficult to get a word in edgewise. And you got to kind of identify, what is their intent? What are they trying to do?
Hmm.
Now, in some cases, they might be an openly aggressive person. So if they feel like they're doing it and no one's responding to them, then they get more loud, or they might have an issue with you, right? And those kind of individuals, when they have an issue with you, they take umbrage with you. They come right at you. They're aggressive. They might, start yelling or getting louder and never let you have a word in edgewise. So the best strategy for those people when it gets to that point in a difficult conversation is they don't respect, or they won't attack you if they respect you. So it's usually someone that, they really don't respect. So it's getting their attention with nonverbals and saying their name a few times, Lida, Lida, Lida. So they stop talking, right? So they can allow you to kind of jump in, and then you quickly have to say, okay, here's the main point. Here's what I hear you saying. And then, so you're reiterating, you're restating, you're clarifying kind of what they're stating. You're not counterattacking. That never works. You're not trying to defend or explain. And certainly, above all else, don't shut down and become a nothing person, because they don't respect that. The goal is interrupt the attack, hold your ground, backtrack for those main points, say, I'm sorry, Lida, I know I made the mistake. Here's what I'm doing to fix it. Here's why it's not going to happen again in the future. Usually, this kind of behavior is a very honest behavior. Once they know, they feel heard, and you feel like, okay, he gets it. He knows where he made the error. Here's what he's doing to fix it. Here's what he's doing in the future. Then it stops. You can always say at the end, peace with honor. So if they don't want to stop, just you pick the day and the time to meet again, but you have to stop the attack or stop the conversation so that it doesn't get any worse and you can move forward on a more proactive and meaningful basis.
And excellent advice. I once had a communication expert tell me that, once you're in that cycle of attack, refute, attack, refute, like usually nothing good happens. And when it gets to that place, sometimes just saying, to your point, you know what, I'm going to call a timeout. I don't feel we're getting anywhere. I'm going to go grab a cup of coffee or take a walk around the block. Why don't we come back in half an hour? So setting the expectation that the conversation isn't dismissed, but I need to get my thoughts together, because once you feel defensive, once you feel like you're being attacked, you're not open-minded. You're typically not in a very open, receptive place. And the other person, to your point, is picking that up. And so it's just kind of going from bad to worse. And sometimes just calling time out allows everybody to calm down, get some perspective, but always let the person know that you intend to come back and specify, it'll be tomorrow at noon. We'll pick it up then. Maybe you didn't have all the information that the person needed to make the decision, and you're pressing for a decision. So a little bit of grace, a little bit of timeout. Sometimes that helps, unless you've got to solve for it in that moment, can be really helpful. And the last thing I guess I want to touch on before we get into questions is the idea of storytelling, because we're hearing a lot about storytelling and how we frame up narrative when it comes to effective communication. What can you tell us about storytelling?
Well, I started off talking about listening because I think that's a huge underutilized area of communication that everyone can improve upon. But when it comes to the part of the communication where you're talking, the most underutilized skill is storytelling. All great leaders are great storytellers. And then there's two big myths around this that I get a lot from leaders saying, Charles, I'm just not a born storyteller. Well, guess what? It's a skill you develop. No one's a born storyteller. You look at all the great orators throughout history, the vast majority of them hone their craft through certain skills and practices. The other question I get asked a lot is, well, I just don't have any good stories to tell. My life's not worthy of a story. That's also bogus, not true. You have a lot of influential stories if you were just more aware, looking for those stories throughout the environment. What lessons can I learn from this? How can I use this to really make an impact on someone else? So, keep those two things in mind, because stories are so much more compelling. People remember stories well. Look at Hollywood, right? Those are some of the best stories. You remember those so much more and so much more meaning. So don't lead with facts and figures. With our programs, like Lida knows, we want you to start with the story like she did today. Was great. It puts you in the scene. It gives you perspective. It says, yeah, I get that. And guess what? When you tell someone a story versus, even if it's a tough conversation, they aren't, and let's say you're giving them facts and figures, right? Well, if you're giving them facts and figures, it's set up as an argument. So they're going to refute, contradict those facts and figures. Maybe they don't agree. It's a lot harder for someone to disagree with your story because that's your personal experience. So you change the whole dynamic of the communication by using storytelling.
I remember, maybe it was a few years into my public speaking when it occurred to me, and I thought I was being hired as a public speaker to share information, right? Share data, share methodology, and train and teach people. But it occurred to me a couple years in that the questions I would get at the end when we would do Q&A were all about me. What was my experience and how did I come to this topic of personal branding and image management? And I thought, well, that's so odd. Why does anyone care about my story? But that is what they were missing. And so as uncomfortable as it was, I started leaning into those stories and sprinkling them throughout. And even if my experience wasn't exactly what someone else had, they related to it, right? So my opening story, maybe you haven't taken your kids on a Tuesday to Costco. It is the best time of the week to go, by the way. But you've gotten a job offer and you've tried to share good news and didn't give somebody all the context. So it's being able to give enough of yourself. And that is where we have to become vulnerable. And we have to let people know who we are. I think one of the greatest things we can do in effective communication is share our humanness. You talk about the great orators, the great leaders. They let us know who they are. They're not fully transparent, and I don't think anybody should be, but they let us know their authenticity, who they are as people. Would you
Couldn't
agree?
agree with you more. Yes, it's so important. And you don't need a whole lot of stories. It's not where you need a repository of hundreds. 4 or 5 stories. Take one from your family life, from maybe a community engagement or connection or story that you have, maybe something professional. But you'd be amazed with 4 or 5 stories how you can weave those into conversations. And they're so much more powerful in making your points.
Wow. I mean, Charles, you and I could talk about this forever. I know that. And I know that through IMS, you have such great programs on this. Before we get to questions, I always like to wrap these LinkedIn Lives up with some action items, some things you heard today that you can absolutely start putting into play right now. The first, I would say, is learn about your own communication style. How do you default communication? Are you a fast talker? Are you expressive? Do you talk with your hands like I do? Is body language an issue that maybe you need to work a little bit more on? But learn how well your messages land and where, based on conversations like today, you can improve. The second is practice what Charles talked about with active listening. It's not about waiting until the person takes a breath before you jump in. It's about matching and mirroring their cadence and their tone and letting the other person know, I hear you, I see you, I'm tracking, maybe I have some questions, but we're present in the conversation. Pay attention to your own body language. Be careful with those nonverbal communication cues that can send the opposite message of what you're trying to communicate. And I've read research that said that we will actually trust what we see more than what we hear. So as Charles pointed out, if your message is saying, I'm so happy to be here, there's nowhere else I'd rather be on a Wednesday, but your body language and your tone of voice don't match, that's what somebody will pay attention to. Next time you face a conversation with someone who is a difficult personality or who is challenging, take a breath. If you meet them in that level of anxiousness or challenge or offense, defense, sometimes bad things can happen. Sometimes we say things we don't mean to say. So in order to get your message heard, take a deep breath first. Allow yourself the opportunity to step back if it doesn't feel healthy or safe, and proceed again. And then finally, with the idea of storytelling, find those 4 or 5 stories. I have a box with index cards. And whenever I think of a story, I'm talking to someone and something comes up, I just jot down some notes about what was happening. And then when I'm doing a presentation or a meeting with a client, I go through and I pick out the stories that I want to share in that conversation or presentation. So as you think about stories that are either funny or really bring to light what it is you stand for and what you're trying to communicate, jot them down somewhere. It's a Post-it note, a dry erase board, or an index card. We have had such a fabulous conversation. I know there have been questions coming in that we haven't gotten to. I do want to make sure I thank Charles for his time today because I know he's a very busy guy. You can learn more about Charles and IMS, which is his organization, at ims-online.com. You can find him on LinkedIn. He's on there as well. Before I get to questions, I want to remind everybody that next month in June, we're going to be speaking with a leader in the commercial real estate space about how executive presence and leadership presence really helped her build her career as one of the formidable leaders in commercial real estate, which is currently a little bit of a challenging market right now. So with that, Sabrina, what questions do we have that we should tackle? Let's see our first one come up. And there we go. Oh, thank you, Dr. Arun. Lida and Charles, don't you think stepping back and opting for written communication can help you communicate better when there's a possibility of confusion and misrepresentation? Your take, please. Oh, that is an excellent question. So, Charles, when do we say, you know what, I'd rather put this in writing? Because that sends a different tone too. When is that appropriate?
Yeah, and we really haven't talked much about written communication. What I'd recommend when it's a sensitive topic, a difficult conversation, don't put it in writing. You can't assess tone from writing. They can misinterpret the words. So yes, there's some clarity around the words, but like we mentioned during this time here, there's so much of your communication, a lot of it is nonverbal. So they're going to miss a lot of what you're saying. So if it's a sensitive topic, an important topic, a difficult conversation, do it not in writing. Instead, get on Zoom, hopefully live. In person's even best, but just be careful what you say and read it out loud. Make sure it's appropriate. I've done a lot of emails where it was something that was sensitive or I was emotionally charged, and I wrote it down and then I just erased it. Right? It was kind of a way to vent and just to get the stuff out of me. I felt better. I knew I wasn't going to send it, but it was therapeutic in some ways and cathartic.
Yeah, I never put the person's name in the to box if I'm doing that, because with my luck, I will hit send.
There you go.
And I think to the question, you're right? We should always opt to try and have conversation in person or by phone or by Zoom so we can get more context, we can hear tone. But sometimes it's appropriate to follow up and thank the person. I appreciate your candor, being willing to have this conversation. Just to reiterate, here's what we talked about, because if that person was highly charged, maybe they didn't remember it the way you did. And so maybe as an afterthought, put it in writing, just so you do have documentation if that's necessary, depending on the conversation.
You bet.
So, excellent. Let's take our next question. What are the positive indicators of behaviors? Ooh, Charles, I'll let you tackle that one first.
So once again, if you're just on Zoom, it's the positive signs in their face. So a fake smile versus a genuine smile. We really didn't go over this, but a fake smile doesn't engage the upper part of your face. A real smile engages your eyes. So you see the crow's feet when they actually smile. A fake smile just smiles outward, sideways. So that's one indicator. They're less tense, right? Their eyes are more responsive. They're open. They could be more engaged. The pupils possibly dilated. And those gravity-defying behaviors, like my eyebrows raise up, right, are all indicators that, yeah, they're positive. And the more they use their hands. So if you could see more of their body, even the better, because you want to look for those gravity-defying behaviors with their hands, palm flash up, those bouncing feet. If they're alive and in person, that's another positive indicator that they're really connecting with what they're saying, they're believing it. When someone's lying or deceiving, everything shuts down, and we have what's called the turtle look, where they try to shrink themselves and become as small as possible, and they stop moving. Then that's an indicator, maybe not of deception, but of stress. They're not comfortable or committed to what they're saying.
I actually worked with an executive a while ago who was a fan of Botox, and she had a lot of Botox in her face. She looked admittedly fabulous, but she got a lot of feedback that her team thought she was angry or that she wasn't understanding because her face didn't move. And so she actually stopped doing Botox so that, to your point, we could see the crinkles in her eyes and her forehead did move. So as well as, disabilities, we also have to think about people who, do a little bit here and there, that sometimes that can throw off the signals that we're sending. Excellent. What else do we have, Sabrina? Do we have another? Super Ronald says, what about if someone is tapping their foot while seated? You mentioned this, Charles, and you called it kind of happy feet. Can it also indicate something else?
Sure. So it could indicate that they are happy, that they're confident, that they're positive, or that they're nervous. They want to get out, high energy, nervousness. So once again, context really plays a big role here. And these indicators aren't necessarily 100% accurate, but they give you kind of an idea of where to focus your attention. So then ask those clarifying questions. If you don't think it's going well, if they're not confident in what they're saying, why are they nervous? It looks to me, it seems to me that you're not really, that you're kind of nervous about this, or this is uncomfortable for you. Can you help me understand a little bit more?
Well, and I did work with somebody who did that, bounced his feet all the time. And it used to make me nervous because I would pick up on that nervous energy. And I would do things like, if we were on a video call, I would ask him to go to a website. So I started engaging with his hand, and he was moving his mouse and going to a website and clicking through. If we were in person, and I think you mentioned this, I would give him something to look at, because a lot of times that nervous energy, it doesn't have a place to leave our bodies, and our hands and our feet are kind of the last places. So giving somebody something to do, a task or an object to hold, at least allows them to kind of expel that energy.
You bet.
Do we have one more question, Sabrina, or how are we doing on questions? I know we tackled a lot of what was being talked about. Anything else you didn't get a chance to say that you think would be helpful, Charles, before we finish out today?
Well, just one thing about storytelling that we kind of ended with is just
Mhm.
you don't retell a story, you relive it. So you have to put them into the scene, right? Put them into the scene, make them feel what you're feeling and going through, and bring them as part of that story. That's such a critical element of storytelling that I just wanted to make sure that came across. And everyone gets better with practice, right? It takes practice to become a better listener. It's not just the default setting, and it's just everyone thinks they're good at listening. That's one of the few communication practices. When you survey people, everyone thinks they're good at it. A lot of people are not good at it. So being more aware, being more mindful, and those tips that you gave, Lida, were so practical and great that if people just applied one of those
Mhm.
would be great. Because as you mentioned when you introduced me, my mantra is it's not what you know, it's what you do that makes a difference, right?
We do have Dr. Arun Shukla is asking that we talk about finger tapping and sort of those nervous finger movements. Anything left on that before we finish out?
Yeah.
Is
So once again, that's a lot like the kind of the tapping with the feet and whatnot. I mean, find some ways to engage their hands so they're less
Mhm.
likely to do it. Some people don't even know they're doing it, right?
Yeah.
It's the finger tapping, it's the leg bouncing, it's other things that they do. So it's a nervous behavior, or it's something that they're really happy and confident about, or maybe that's just part of who they are. So context helps. Give them something to do so that if they're not writing, here's the handout. Why don't you start taking notes? Why don't you start looking at this presentation on my laptop? So that usually helps to stop it, because you're right, Lida, it makes you more nervous and high
Oh, yeah.
energy if you don't find a way to correct it.
And my good friend Stephanie mentions pen clicking. Oh my gosh, I didn't think there were still people who do pen clicking, but yes, all of those nervous habits. And to my first point, like pay attention to your own communication. What are you doing to send the wrong message? And that could be taking away from the impact of what you're really trying to communicate. Thank you so much, Charles Good, president of IMS, Institute for Management Studies. Find them online, find him on LinkedIn, connect with him. Brilliant, a lot of great content. I know people are going to go back and watch this program again because the recording will be posted shortly. And there was so much, I'm sure most people couldn't write fast enough. I look forward to seeing you next month where we're talking about executive presence. In the meantime, be sure to follow me, sign up for my newsletter. We're going to have a lot more information on this topic. And I wish everyone a wonderful rest of your day. Stay safe, stay healthy, and keep building those brands. Talk to you soon. Bye.